So my inspiration for this this view of mine, I gave you my kind of where I stand. This is not just my view. This is the view of virtually all Islamic modernists, who, and this may be a term you're not too familiar with, but it's an academic term. Not a lot of modernists like to be called modernist. As an academic, I have no problem with it. But there are all sorts of reformists that fall under this category. And they are all calling for what can be called the Qur'anic turn. Amongst these Islamic modernists, the Qur'anists, or the Ahl Qur'an, the Qur'an-only movement, is a subset, a small subset of it. I think they've made some worthy contributions to the dialogue. I'm even going to show you some of their slides, which I think are very helpful. But ultimately, I want to reiterate that it's much more expansive. This Hadith skepticism is much more expansive than Hadith rejection. So Hadith skepticism is a much larger circle, and only a subset of it would be called Hadith rejectors. And so this kind of line of thinkers is predominant in South Asia, but also there is some of this action going on in the Arab world as well. My focus is on South Asia. So you see, I kind of traced this trajectory from Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan in the 19th century, as well as his colleague Shirag Ali, all the way to in the next century, we see Fazl Rahman and Nasr Abu Zaid. So these are my kind of inspirations, and I'm trying to follow their work and methodology. And there are many scholars in the academy who are following this kind of trajectory, where we say that we're going to allow the Quran to speak for itself instead of viewing the Quran through the lens of the Hadith, instead of viewing the Quran through the lens of Asbab al-Nuzul literature and all this other secondary literature that is a derivative of the Hadith. And that includes the tafsir literature as well. So we want to read the Quran on its own terms. And this is, again, Fazl Rahman. This is another academic, Jerusha Tanner-Lamptey. I think she changed her name to, last name is Rhodes now, but she has a great book called Never Wholly Other. I follow her methodology as well in my academic work, which is to primarily and initially focus on the Quran, and then have a hermeneutics of suspicion when it comes to any other source, including the Hadith. And so she does state at the beginning of her book that she is not a quote-unquote Quran-only advocate, but she is a Quran-centric advocate, and I am in the same vein. It's not only Muslim academics who have come to this conclusion. In fact, Patricia Crone, who in her early days wrote the kind of controversial book Hagerism, she later became a more sober-minded academic, and she did some great scholarship in the field of Near Eastern studies. But even near the end of her life, she realized that what the classical exegetes were doing was replacing the Quranic context with a new one. This is because they were reading the Quranic verses in isolation. And this is an insight that I kind of use that guides my research and shows how this atomistic approach, how Hadith is one tool that the classical exegetes will use to often subvert the Quran or even invert the Quranic logic. And we can talk about that in a bit. But here we see Patricia Crone saying that this idea of understanding the Quran in the light of the Quran itself is the method that even secular historians should use. So this is a methodology that will work for you academically, as well as if you're a Muslim theologically, I'm arguing. Now, why is this issue of Hadith so important? I would argue that it is so important because it is emblematic of a larger debate that goes on in Islamic intellectual history since the very beginning. And that is, what is the role of reason in religion? Now, and that's one of the reasons why I taught a course. It's available on YouTube. I'm grateful to the Ghamdi Center for allowing me to teach that course with full intellectual freedom. But what I try to teach in my course is what Muhammad Arkoun calls the exhaustive tradition. That is to say, we're often told by traditionalists that we need to stick to the tradition. But when they talk about the tradition, I think they have a very blinkered view of what the tradition is. That is, if they are Ash'ari, it's only the Ash'ari tradition, or maybe the Maturidis along with them, which is kind of a sister school now. Or it's the Hanbali or the Salafi. Hanbalis are kind of, you can call them many different things. They go under many different names. But today they're often known as Wahhabis or Salafis. So you have these two forms of the tradition that are kind of viewed exclusively. And meanwhile, the other elements of our tradition are ignored. And these include the Islamic rationalists, the Mu'tazilis, and the Islamic philosophers, or the falasifa. And what's important to keep in mind is that many of these Islamic rationalists and Islamic philosophers were very much and considered themselves to be within the greater camp of Sunni Islam. They're often, you'll see many scholars, and some honestly secular academics wrongfully exclude them from Sunnism, and that's really because the Ash'aris, Maturidis, and Hanbalis will try to kick them out of the Sunni camp. So often you will see Sheikh Yasir Qadi say, as far as Sunnis are concerned, and then he differentiates Sunnis from Mu'tazilis. But we need to understand this as a sectarian confessional claim and not take it as an academic historical one, because the Mu'tazilis would definitely, at least in their heyday, were mostly Sunnis. Eventually their thought was absorbed by Shiism and survived in some ways, but initially they were within the Sunni camp. And then I also say that we need to look at other non-Sunni groups, including unorthodox Sufis, humanists, other non-Sunni groups such as Twelver and Ismaili Shias. We need to have an expansive view and be open-minded with our history. And even I forgot to mention in here, I think one group that has gotten a really bad shake are the Khawarij, the Kharijites. Yes, they had extremist groups that kind of, we think about ISIS and that, as neo-Khawarij and stuff. But I think probably the Khawarij were a diverse group with many different views. And this label of Khawarij would just kind of blanket labeled on them. But they were actually one of the groups that also took a Hadith skeptical or even rejected Hadith completely. I'm betting in the future that some of their views will be rehabilitated. Unfortunately, we have only very limited access of their views because it's often through the lens of their opponents that we see them. But it's important to keep in mind that Hadith skepticism was prevalent amongst the Islamic rationalists and Islamic philosophers as well, I would assume, definitely amongst the Islamic rationalists and Mu'tazilis. Now, why is this, again, why am I saying all of this in a talk about Hadith? Well, it's all about the battle between reason and revelation. If we look at the four main groups, the Hanbalis were what we can call fideistic or literalistic. They had a very low view of reason. So reason was very low compared to revelation. Ash'aris, who are, you can kind of think, so Hanbalis are like the Wahhabi Salafis today. And then the other group that's considered Sunni Orthodoxy are the Ash'aris and their sister group of Maturidis. But really, we think of Ash'aris in history. This is what Al-Azhar University represents. They're often called semi-rationalist. I think if they're called semi-rationalist, we can also call them semi-fideistic as well. Depends on which half of the glass you're considering this. I definitely think in some parts of history, like Fakhruddin al-Razi would probably be on the side of the rationalist side. I think in recent decades, however, there has been a turn towards fideism. That is this kind of attachment to textual reports. And I think this is the effect and the influence of Wahhabis or Salafis that's kind of had an effect across the Islamic world. And so you see this turn towards more textualism. And so what I said is they also historically, or at least formally, said that reason is below revelation. And I think in recent times, this has, like I said, gotten even worse. The Maturidis are represented today by like the Deobandis in India, Pakistan, and they have a very bad view of, I grew up in that kind of milieu, and they have a very negative view of human reason. Human reason is considered whimsical. It's considered, you're just following your whims and desires instead of your mind and your heart. It's considered passion, and whims and desires. And I think most Muslims grew up with this view that, you shouldn't use your reasoning. That's something negative. You should really just bow down to the text. And that's the text. Which text are we talking about? We're talking about the Hadith. Now, I should make a disclaimer that Maturidis historically were considered the halfway house between Ash'aris and Mu'tazilis. In fact, in some ways, they might have been closer to Mu'tazilis when in the sense of valuing reason. But later, as history goes on, they will lean more towards Ash'aris, to the point that in the modern period, I would say the difference between them is minimal. And like I said, today they're represented most by, Deoband, which is very much against reason. So now they would want to hide any similarity to Mu'tazilis. They would want to differentiate themselves from, and so we see this kind of rightward shift. Hanbalis are causing this rightward shift on Ash'aris, and Ash'aris are causing this rightward shift on Maturidis. So then we come to the Mu'tazilis, who are the Islamic rationalists. They took, I think, the most balanced view of reason being equal to revelation. Reason goes hand in hand with revelation. This is my view, and this is the view of, honestly, most Islamic modernists, I would say. We are still beholden to the text, but we believe that you need to use your reason, your God-given reason that God gave you to understand revelation. Now you have the fourth group, which is the Falasifa. These are the Islamic philosophers. Of course, they were also rationalists. Some might say hyper-rationalist. They placed reason above revelation. I think they have some insights that are worthwhile for us to, at least consider in our modern context. I've talked about this in the past. So these are the four groups that have existed in Islamic history, the major groups. I mean, there are many other groups, of course, I'm simplifying here. But what you see is that the last, the rationalists in this debate would want to minimize, the proliferation of hadiths. Or let me put it the other way around, actually. It's probably better the other way around, in the sense that if you have a very dim view of reason, then you need to, after the Prophet dies, you need to generate a lot of texts in order to answer your questions for new events that happen. And so you need to close any door for any justification for humans to use their reason. So you need to generate textual reports. And this is what causes a mass proliferation of hadiths. And this is why hadith then becomes the central issue in this battle between reason and revelation. So again, I kind of reiterated it here, that after the Prophet's death, the new community needed a way to decide new matters. The Shia, of course, could turn to an infallible imam, at least before the imam went into occultation. But what about the Sunnis? One group turned to reason. This is the people of reasoned opinion, depending on, you can translate as reasoned opinion or speculative opinion if you have a negative view of it. And another group turned to text in the form of hadith, and this became the people of hadith. And these two groups were kind of the precursors to the four groups that I talked about, at least the top three groups. The Ahl Hadith was the precursor to the Hanbalis, and the Ahl al-Rai were the precursor to the Mu'tazilis, as well as, Hanafis, who later would go another route, but it's a little bit more complicated. The point, though, is if you hold a dim view of human reason, then you are forced to generate textual reports for every single action. This, of course, led to the mass proliferation of hadith. So the battle about hadith is really about the role of reason in religion. And that's why it's central to any sort of Islamic reform today. So hadith skeptics, and that's what I consider myself, a hadith skeptic, not a hadith rejecter, but a hadith skeptic. We are suspicious of the hadiths based on 3 points: the authority of hadith, the authenticity of hadith, and the acceptability of hadith. I'm really going to focus on, in this presentation, only on the first one, really, the authority of the hadith. I think I'll have to make another presentation for the other 2 points, because I think the first one is the strongest critique. The other ones are open for debate. I do have a video on lecture on authenticity, in which I talk about how even using the isnad paradigm, there's an inconsistency in the hadith system, in the sense that the first generation, the Sahaba, are not subjected to the hadith criticism like all the other levels of the chain are, and this is quite problematic. I have a video on that. We can link to you that later. But in this lecture, I'm really going to talk about the first one, the authority of the hadith in relation to the Qur'an. That is, what is the ontological status of the hadith? The second point, authenticity, is really about epistemology. And the third point, acceptability. This is about those hadiths that are so problematic that people, and it's usually the third point that causes people to become hadith skeptics to begin with. And this is often criticized. So for example, Dr. Jonathan Brown will say, oh, you're just bothered about, I talk about Aisha's age, and this is an issue that will push people towards hadith skepticism. I don't think that there's a problem with becoming a hadith skeptic based on the hadith corpus being acceptable or not to you. Ultimately, I think that's what makes us believers in a thing or not. It's not 1 and 2, it's 3, the acceptability. The same thing with the Quran. I don't believe in the Quran priori that it's authoritative. That's something that I have to arrive at. Secondly, it's not the authenticity of the Quran. I mean, there could be another text that's perfectly well transmitted, but I wouldn't believe in it as scripture. No, it's the acceptability of the Quran. That is to say that I read the Quran and I say, hey, you know what? This is an inspirational text, so I think it's inspired. That's really my logic. So I think a lot of people come to the Hadith literature and they feel like it doesn't hit their heart in the same way. Rather, it doesn't seem of divine origin at all. It doesn't seem inspired. It seems quite crass. Some parts of it are quite vulgar. It just doesn't match up with the style and content of the Quran. And that's why people become Hadith skeptics. But I'm not going to really focus on this third point, but I just wanted to say that it is a valid reason to become a Hadith skeptic. The other thing I would say is that all three of these points existed from the very beginning of the early Islam, from the first generation. That is, Hadith skeptics existed since that time, and they attacked the Hadith on all three of these points. It is a myth that Hadith skepticism only started in the modern period due to kind of bowing down to liberal secularism and being, having this inferiority complex. This is a narrative that traditionalists like to spin, but it's just not factual. Yes, there are some things that bother us in the modern day, but there were things similar to that that used to bother people about the Hadith way before colonialism and the West had to say anything about them.